rapa, its domestication and its de-domestication, or ferality, as you're learning about a lot in this class, I'm sure, as well as ethnobotany. So I won't focus on that part, but I'll definitely discuss it as well. And just for some background, this is, it's just one plant, and it might be seen as maybe not the most common crop in your diet, but it is representative, and it's closely related to model species like Arabidopsis, as you know. So it has a lot of interest as a system to understand these phenomena of domestication and ferality. Also, Brassica are interesting in that some people consider them to be the dogs of the plant world. And by that, I mean, it's one species that humans have diversified with artificial selection into lots of different breeds. So just like wolves turning into Chihuahua and Poodle and Pit Bull, we have Brassica oleracea, for example, turning into Brussels sprouts and cabbage, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, because of people selecting on different organs of the plant. But it's not just Brassica oleracea, which is maybe the most familiar one. There are other ones like Brassica rapa. So this is wild Brassica oleracea. Here's wild Brassica rapa, which the team in Argentina knows very well and has become a major pest, as I'm sure they have or will talk about. It's very interesting. So Brassica oleracea has turned into all of those crops I just mentioned, but Brassica rapa has also turned into a lot of different crops. So some of them might be familiar or less familiar. Turnips or nabos, of course, but also a lot of these Asian vegetables from China and Japan. Also oil seeds from India and oil seeds that are used around the world. So some percentage of canola, some 10%, is actually from Brassica rapa. So these are economically important crops. This one probably more so in Asia, and this one more in the rest of the temperate world. But these crops also have very interesting relationships, and sorry for the blurry image. So we've been talking about Brassica oleracea and Brassica rapa. It has another name, Brassica campestris, as well. But those have an interesting history because a long time ago, they crossed with each other. And if you're familiar with polyploidization, they created an allopolyploid. So it took both of their genomes combined, so chromosomes from both, and that resulted in Brassica napus, which is the main crop for canola, which is in many of our cooking oils that you might use every day. But that's only one side of the triangle of U, so-called, named after a Korean scientist working in Japan who figured out this relationship. There's also Brassica nigra, which is often in mustard seeds, so in the condiment of mustard, if you use mustard on a sandwich or something. But that crossed with Brassica rapa turned into Brassica juncea, which had resulted in a lot of leaf crops, and crossed with Brassica oleracea to make an Ethiopian or Abyssinian kale. So it's a really interesting, not just species, but genus in terms of these crops, their diversification, and their relationships. As I mentioned before, they're also interesting because they're closely related to Arabidopsis, which you probably know as the most well-studied plant in the world in terms of genetics. We know a great deal about the functional genomics of Arabidopsis. So this locus is responsible for this trait, for example, or these series of loci. Also useful is that some of these species are rapid cycling, and by that I mean they have short life cycles. So one variety of Brassica rapa, you can plant the seed and 1 month later harvest a seed. So that's called the rapid cycling Brassica rapa, or Wisconsin fast plant. The diverse targets of selection, meaning the leaves or the roots for different crops, and the fact that these different Species, people have selected sometimes in convergent ways. So for Brassica rapa, they've made turnips. Brassica napus, rutabagas. How do you say rutabaga in Nabicol? No, I can't hear.
Rutabaga es, Claudio?
Rutabaga, al mejor. Uh,
I don't
and
know.
then there are root forms of Brassica ginsea and then kohlrabi from Oleracea. So people have selected in parallel in different parts of the world for similar morphologies. But today I'm going to focus on this one and this one, rapa and Oleracea, because that's where I focused most of my work and collaborative efforts. So starting with Brassica oleracea, this is a collaboration with my postdoc, Mackenzie Mabry. This is actually a very bad figure. This is not hers or mine, but this is a picture of Brassica rapa, it looks like, but they're demonstrating the relationships to Brassica oleracea crops. So don't look too closely at it. But the big question that we were interested in is, what is the wild ancestor or wild relative of all of these? And you've probably talked about crop wild relatives before. We want to know this for a lot of reasons. So one is the center of diversity for this species is probably held in the wild relatives. And so if there are breeding needs and we want to make our broccoli more drought tolerant, or make our cauliflower resist a pest, or make our kale have bigger leaves, we can find a large gene pool in the wild. But there's currently a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty about which exact populations are, and species even, are wild for Brassica oleracea. And there are a lot of different candidates. So people have put forth all of these. These have the same, cytologically, they're similar. They're closely related. There's wild Brassica oleracea even, but all of these other ones mostly around the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of Europe. So one likely candidate is these wild Brassica oleracea, which you might just assume is the wild relative or wild progenitor or wild ancestor of domesticated Brassica oleracea. So why might it not be that, I guess? This is my early question for you. Why could it be something else other than the wild Brassica oleracea that we know from this area? So I'll jump in. It could be feral. It could be escaped from cultivated crops and not truly wild. Another hypothesis is that maybe it's somewhere here in the central Mediterranean. Sicily is a center of diversity for these putative wild relatives, for example. And another is the Eastern Mediterranean. These two crops, not crops, wild plants are very interesting. And there are linguistic and literary sources that suggest these might have turned into domesticated Brassica oleracea as we know it. And so working together, this was led by Mackenzie Mabry, the postdoc. She did RNA sequencing of a lot of these crops. We also have whole genome resequencing data. But here are where the possible progenitors come out, and I'll show you that interestingly, the Brassica oleracea that we thought was wild, maybe, came out way over here with the crops. So not even in just one part of the tree with the other crops, but across in different areas, suggesting maybe multiple fertilization events. If you look at a more simplified tree, we have the crops up here, Interspersed with these crops are Brassica oleracea feral weeds. But here, Brassica cretica comes out sister to all of the cultivated types. So that's compelling evidence that maybe cretica is the closest living relative to the progenitor. There's also interesting kind of interdisciplinary approaches that our team was able to take. So we brought in archaeologists and historians to help with this. And so from these very old, almost, this is more than 4,000, no, not 4,000 years, this is before present. So over 2,000 years ago, there are mentions of these wild relatives and crops that suggest that Eastern Mediterranean might have been important, including the Aegean Islands. I did a very kind of simple, and now I'm embarrassed of how simple it was, species distribution model or niche model or ecological niche model of these different species to understand where in the late Holocene, so this is thousands of years ago, maybe 8,000 years ago, when we expect roughly the domestication to have taken place, where would the wild species have been located? So this is yet another line of evidence. So far we have genomic, historical, and ecological lines of evidence. So that was our work on oleracea. We're still working on that. We have a new grant with Mackenzie looking at feral Brassica oleracea and feral Brassica rapa to see if there are genes that are responsible for drought tolerance and these other potential benefits that can be drawn into our crops to make them stronger. So any questions so far? All right, I will continue on with Brassica rapa. So as I mentioned, selection on wild Brassica rapa has turned it into turnips, as well as these other crops, bok choy, Chinese cabbage or Napa cabbage, yellow sarsen and brown sarsen, the oil seeds in India and Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and then all of these other ones. So have you guys tried some of these or seen some of these at grocery stores? Or probably bok choy and Chinese cabbage, and some of them are pretty hard to find at our grocery stores. But again, just like in the Brassica oleracea, it was unclear what the wild Brassica rapa was. And what we do know is that around the world, in temperate areas, it grows as a weed in farmlands and roadsides and disturbed areas. And in some cases, it competes with crops, but often it's just kind of a naturalized plant that grows at low frequency. But as your professors will tell you, that this has changed and it's become a kind of a monster and zombie in Argentina and Uruguay now. So here's a little map of some locations for the wild or weedy Brassica rapa around the world, drawn from GBIF, which is a data portal. I now know that it grows more extensively over in Asia, but those data points aren't represented on this map. So another interesting piece is that in Latin America, and to some extent elsewhere in the Americas, weedy Brassica rapa, or wild Brassica rapa, has entered the diet of many people. So people eat it as an edible weedy plant. In Argentina, in the Northwest, I think it's called yuyos or yuyos. And in Peru, it's yuyos, and in Mexico, it's hoja de nabo or apoxquilitl, many other names, mequaseri. So here you can see in Mexico, this is a farmer, a Raramuri farmer from northwestern Mexico, who's picking edible weedy plants. So they're not really malezas, they're more kind of buenesas or something, if I can make up a word. But in Mexico, they're called quelites because they're useful weedy plants. And that word comes from Nahuatl, the indigenous Aztec language. And this woman has collected these weedy Brassica rapa and is selling them at a market. So these are some of the different ethnic groups that have adopted this introduced plant as food, because we know it's native to Europe, Asia, and Africa, but it has been quickly adopted as a food source for indigenous people, especially in Latin America. And I did a little bit of a focus study during my PhD on the Raramuri people. So this woman is Raramuri in her cornfield. The reason is that in 1979, a researcher saw this practice of Raramuri people harvesting seeds of weedy field mustard and planting them in their fields intentionally. And this is maybe an example of redomestication or incipient redomestication, which is kind of a unique opportunity, a treat to get to observe domestication in progress. Here's this 1979 paper, Robert Bai. The Raramuri appear to be on the track of domesticating a local ecotype of an old world weed in the New World, independent of the European and Asian centers. So that really caught my interest and sparked a lot of this work. As I mentioned, being able to observe the transition from wild to domesticated is really rare. And it gives you the opportunity to observe what's happening ecologically between humans and the plant, as well as the plant and other plants, plant and insects, as well as the cultural context. So, for example, with maize or rice or wheat, we can't go back in time and talk to the farmers and ask them, what do you like in your rice that you're selecting for, or how do you harvest it in a selective manner? But we can ask Raramuri farmers what their thinking and cognition is around this. So anyway, that kind of led to the questions that we have been answering ever since. What is the wild population? How did it become domesticated? What's the diversity of domesticated ones? How did they get introduced all over the world? How are they adopted by different cultures? And how are they being domesticated today by Raramuri farmers? And so we'll go through these one step at a time. So we took kind of different approaches to this, a genomic approach using genotyping by sequencing, or GPS, growth experiments in greenhouses under controlled conditions, growing different ecotypes and crops side by side in randomized plots, niche modeling, and then interviews with farmers. So we'll start with this first question. Are weedy populations of Brassica rapa wild or feral? The reason is just like with the Brassica oleracea in England, it wasn't clear whether the populations all around the world are truly wild, like wolves, or whether they're feral, like wild dogs that have escaped. And one reason we care about that is we expect the diversity to be different. As you've probably learned about domestication bottlenecks in diversity, when wild organisms are bred and selected over many generations, they're often inbred or crossed with their relatives, which can reduce the total diversity. But then interesting things happen when they go feral, because the feral populations are often a subset of the domesticated populations, or a cross between domesticated and wild populations. So it's hard to predict what the diversity in the feral crops will be, as we will see. And one other challenge is that it's hard to conserve the truly wild populations versus the weeds. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we should conserve all of them. But in other cases, the weeds can be problems, as they have become in Argentina. So we basically did this genotyping by sequencing pipeline and pulled out different single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, for about 190 wild or weedy samples. We'll just call them weedy because at this point we don't know if they're feral or wild in the story. And we greatly increased the number of wild or weedy or feral collections done sequenced compared to previous studies. So that was kind of the main contribution of this work. And we also sequenced a bunch of crops. So 11 different types of Brassica rapa crops, close to 400 different samples of them. And here's what we got. So this is a coalescent tree using SVD quartets. So it's using the outgroup of Brassica oleracea. You can see this broad breakdown into European and West Asian crops. So like broccoli rabe in Italy, turnips in Europe, also grelos in Spain, and then East and South Asian, so bok choy, mizuna, and these oil seeds. But what we see at this very bottom here, sister to everything else, other than the outgroup, are the weedy plants from the Caucasus Mountains. So if you're familiar with the Caucasus, these are Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, these countries northeast of Turkey and south of Russia. This was very interesting to us. But just as interesting was that all of the other populations, basically, that we sequenced were up here in this part of the tree that's basically turnips. So what conclusion that led us to is that these populations are likely feral or escaped turnips. So this is what the map looks like. Previously, it was assumed that all of these were truly wild. And so if you go to a lot of seed banks, for example, in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, they have a lot of collections from these places with the assumption that they were truly wild. So from this, we hope to make additional collections in this part of the world and do some comparative studies between wild and domesticated populations. So are you all familiar with teosinte? Okay, yeah, so they are?
They must.
They must be. Good. Because so we've known that teosinte was the wild progenitor of maize for a long time. And that's allowed these one-to-one comparisons, wild to domesticated, which have given us many insights. This hasn't been possible with Brassica rapa, Brassica oleracea, some of these other crops, because the specific wild relative has not been pinpointed. So we're very excited about the potential there. So a brief break to talk about Brassica napus, because it's hard to leave out of this story. It looks similar to, it looks actually intermediate between Brassica rapa and Brassica oleracea. It can be a little bit hard to distinguish in the field from Brassica rapa and napus, but it was domesticated into rutabaga and canola. But there's also a lot of questions about which Brassica rapa and which Brassica oleracea crossed to make Brassica napus. So a lot of the evidence we have suggests that rapini, the Italian flowering tops, is rapini a common food in Argentina? Can you find it? Or broccoli rabe? So it's kind of a bitter vegetable in Italy. And that appears to be closely related. We did some genetic work, also RNA sequencing with Brassica napus, and then rapa and oleracea, and we were able to corroborate this, that rapini seems to be the progenitor on this side, but still a lot of questions about what was the progenitor on the Brassica oleracea side. So we have some evidence that actually Algerian wild Brassica rapa might be even closer than rapini, but that's a secret, and give us co-authorship if you find that out on your own. Okay, so then how was it domesticated? So this has long been a question because it's a dog of the plant world. It was a super diverse process. I'm thinking of another crop like wheat. Wheat, there's certainly a lot of differentiation between the soft and the hard wheats, but this is really radically different morphologically compared to, a lot of wheat looks more or less the same, but bok choy and Chinese cabbage look totally different plants. So different questions exist. Were all of these different types of crops selected directly from wild populations separately? Or was some crop selected first and then the other crops selected from that? When did it happen and where did it happen? So if it was the case where one crop was selected first, which crop was it? And here's one part hypothesis where the leafy types were selected first, and then farmers realized, oh, some of these have big, juicy turnips. Let's select for bigger turnips. We like this part. And so that is all conjecture to some degree. So we looked at our PCA of our sequencing data, the same genotyping by sequencing data, and here it is. So if you look in the very middle, you see those wild populations from the Caucasus. If you look up here, you see the East Asian crops. If you look down here, the South Asian crops. Here are the West Asian and Central Asian crops. So this is Afghanistan, for example, turnips in Afghanistan and Iran. European turnips and that Italian broccoli rabe or rapini. And these are the Latin American weedy ones. So there are also weedy ones here. So if you look at the different crops in this map, you see that the oil seeds come out here mostly, turnips come out here, and then the leafy greens come out here. So this already tells an interesting story that suggests that the leafy greens have a separate origin and may have been selected independently from turnips in different parts of the world. So this is what, combined with our tree, our coalescent tree, we think happened, is that turnips were selected into leafy greens in Europe, in Italy, and Spain, and then also in Asia, probably in China, into leafy crops as well. We also have evidence that it happened separately, so 2 different times in Europe, as you can see here in the tree. And then as to when it happened, so we suspect that turnips were the first crop domesticated. When did it happen? We have this little bit of archaeological evidence. So where were seeds and parts of plants found at different times? And turnips are much older in terms of the evidence we have than the other crops. And next is oil seeds in India. So we did a demographic model. So there are different tools for this. You might have heard of Dadi, moments, this kind of ABC models that allow you to test in an explicit way these hypotheses about populations and when they split from each other and their relationships with each other since. So from this, we have this estimation of 5,712 years ago, when the turnips were splitting from the wild ones in the Caucasus. And then where? So if we look at the map, different hypotheses have been put forth for different centers of origin of this crop. We did a niche model looking back 6,000 years ago to see what the climate would have been. And the dark areas show areas that were suitable for weedy Brassica rapa. And you can see there's basically a line all the way from Spain and Morocco that goes all the way to China as suitability. So that doesn't narrow things down very well. But what we do find is that 2 of these 3 branches out from this Caucasus center point are in this area of the Hindu Kush in the Western Himalayas. So that strongly suggests that this was an important area for the early selection of this crop. And we also have China, but these samples were from Western China, also in the Himalayas. So we would like to go sample more of these in the Himalayas in the future. So all in all, this shows us that these are some priority areas for future research, but also conservation of genetic diversity, not just of wild, but of crop varieties. We're working now on a paper looking at the domestication syndrome. So have you guys talked about the domestication syndrome? Great. So we're looking at which genes underlie these traits and which similarities there are in terms of the control of these traits across different Brassica rapa crop types. So Grelos and Rapini, for example, which ones are shared and which ones are different. All right, now getting to the invasive or introduced or weedy or naturalized populations around the world. As we learned from the previous work, all of these appear to be feral, but what kind of feral are they? So how did they originate? How did they get around the world? And what are areas that might be vulnerable to future invasion? So looking at a structure plot, this is fast structure. We have the European turnips, which have this, are characterized by this kind of yellow ancestry, and the European feral crops, which are also very characterized by this yellow ancestry. And so you have these European ones here, but those ones, it could be that they originated directly from escape from domesticated populations, or it could be the result of a cross between the wild and the domesticated populations, turning into the feral, which is very common. A lot of the feral crops around the world and a lot of the feral animals around the world resulted from a cross between wild and domesticated, as you may have learned. So we wanted to understand whether we were looking at endoferal or exoferal populations around the world. One piece of evidence we were interested in was the diversity. So we would expect, we would have the hypothesis that in the case of endoferal, meaning that a domestication population simply became feral without any wild ancestry, that it would reduce the diversity of the population, because that would just be a subset or a smaller portion of the domesticated diversity. On the other hand, if there was an exoferal event and a wild population or individual crossed with domesticated ones, we would expect diversity to be higher than in domesticated ones. What we found was that domestication was higher in, that diversity was higher in the feral populations than their closely related domesticated crops. So that suggests that there might be some wild introgression. Another thing is, if you look at these European feral ones, you see some of these blue ancestry bars. And if you look at other places these show up, you see them in the wild, which suggests that there might have been some cross at some point between wild and domesticated, resulting in these feral populations. So this is our working hypothesis now, is that it was actually an exoferal event. But how did it get around the world? So where did it come from? This has implications for the control of introduced species. This is really getting into all of Claudio, Alejandro, Sol, and Sophia's work. Is what does it mean for the control of these species? Where did they come from? Did it come from multiple places or one place? Has it adapted to local environments? That's another portion of my work with my postdoc is, if you look, you can find Brassica rapa from Alaska all the way down to Argentina. There are lots of different environments along that latitude that it could potentially be adapting to, and that adaptation could be useful for our crops. So looking at this population up here in Canada is kind of interesting because genetically, it's a little bit different than the other ones in the Americas. So it's got a lot of that European weedy and European turnip ancestry compared to the Latin American weeds, which look to be kind of their own situation. And then we have the ones down here in Latin America and also California, which look different. This is a kind of ugly figure, but you can see here are the Latin American weeds. Here are the Spanish turnips and rapini, rapini being the Italian vegetable, and the North African turnips. Those ones come out typically most closely aligned with the Latin American weeds in our analyses. And we would suggest that there were probably multiple introductions. One thing is that Brassica rapa is a common contaminant in grain. So in oats and wheat and barley, and the Spanish brought a lot of that over. But then this other kind of Northern European spread may have resulted in other populations. And recently I have obtained feral crop samples from Washington State up here, New York State, Pennsylvania. So it'll be very interesting where those fall out, if they're more similar to these or these. And then what areas are vulnerable to invasion? So looking at where it exists now, we can estimate where it is suitable for it to grow and identify areas where it hasn't taken over but may become invasive. So this would be interesting to do specifically with the genotypes that you all have found in Argentina, because it's likely that they could invade all of these places and compete with the naturalized Brassica rapa there. But some areas are the Rift Valley and Ethiopia, Madagascar, Greenland, etc. So one risk of spreading to this area is that it could cross with the native populations and reduce the diversity of the native gene pool of Brassica rapa. So that, I guess, would not be a good situation if the Argentinian and Uruguayan populations reached Georgia. So, okay. These are the implications, is that there's high diversity in the feral populations, which might be useful for breeding. There's likely local adaptation, but we haven't looked into it. And there's a risk for invasion in the native range. So getting to this next point of any questions so far first? I'm kind of just talking and talking. Okay. So then we get to the adoption. So this is more of the ethnobotany chapter of this all. So as I mentioned, in many parts of Latin America, it's eaten as an edible weed. You can see here In some parts, they eat the flowering tops. This is called mubu, or heart, in the Masawa language in Mexico. Here you can see this is a pretty nice looking leaf for a salad or guisado. And so we were curious more on an anthropological side, really, with how do cultures form relationships with new plants? As you know, in the last 500 years, a lot of people around the world have encountered a lot of new plants to them, right? So people moving to new areas, colonialism, all of these movements of people and plants have changed our diets and our floras drastically. But there are also implications, because if people are seeing this as an invasive species, it is also a species that's useful and important for people's food, there becomes a potential tension or potential conflict there. I showed this figure before. These are the different cultural groups that I've documented in the literature as using these mostly for food, but also other uses. And I did interviews in 8 different ethnic groups about the use of weedy Brassica rapa, the management and cultivation of weedy Brassica rapa, and how people think about and feel about newly encountered plants. So I focused on Mexico because of the kind of cultural diversity of people using these plants. I did 167 interviews. These are the different ethnic groups. I asked questions about those topics that I mentioned. And in terms of use, every ethnic group I talked to, they said, we do use it. And a lot of people said it's available when other food is scarce. So it comes up right in the spring when maybe the corn and beans and squash are becoming less available. And so people are very grateful for it and expressed actually a lot of emotion about it. People had figured out ways to dry it, special ways where they kind of smash it up with their hands and then dry it on their roof or dry it over the stove. People who use it for medicine, especially for their lungs or stomach. People use it for bird seed a lot. A lot of Mexico City markets, you can find this vaina del canario, and everyone has a grandma, an abuela somewhere who has little birds. And a lot of people said, it makes the birds sing because they like it so much. And very interestingly, people use different parts of the plant. So in some places, they use the flowering tops, other places just the leaves, other places the little root hypocotyl, turnip, basically. And you can see here on the map the different organs used in different parts. So that is interesting because it's similar to Europe and Asia, where different parts of Europe and Asia use different parts of the plant, leading to this diversification in part. So given another 1,000 years, maybe we'd have a whole nother radiation of Brassica rapa crops in the Americas, but I think globalization is working against that. In terms of management, farmers mentioned sowing, so cultivating it intentionally, transplanting. So this farmer, this is actually Brassica napus that had volunteered. But he said, oh yeah, if we find one that's, I think he said, bien chingada, like a really cool, really good, amazing one, then he'll transplant it and give it extra fertilizer. I think that's kind of a rude word in Mexican Spanish. I don't know how it translates. And then sparing, or kind of like deja de parar, so left tolerated in the field instead of pulled out as a weed. Here's an example. This is Zapotec, people in Oaxaca who have grown peas, so chicharos, but they're spreading Brassica rapa seeds in there from the wild populations to ensure that it produces some of that. But most intensively, the Raramuri people cultivated in these dedicated little plots. So you can see here they've moved the corral for the goats and cows several times. And in this one on the far right, you can see some Brassica rapa because they chopped up the manure and they planted seeds that they had saved from the last year. But those seeds ultimately, a long time ago, derived from the wild populations or weedy feral populations. So they move the corral again and again. Here you can see a little seedling coming up. And so here is a map of the different cultivation or management practices in these different parts. And we did talk to some farmers who had a lot of land or tractors and herbicides, and they really saw Brassica rapa as a weed. So they were, for example, oat farmers, avena, and they said, yeah, it's a problem for us. But we talked to the small holder farmers who said, yeah, this is essential. This is a really key part of our food security and sovereignty, soberanía. And so this has always been interesting to me. Why do people adopt a crop or reject it? And part of it, I think, is that sometimes the traditional knowledge of the crop comes with the crop and sometimes it doesn't. One example is, do you know nopales, the opuntia? So opuntia, Ficus indica, is the cactus. The cactus stems are used as food in Mexico. Also agave hearts are used as food in Mexico. And then amaranthus is used as a food in Mexico. But if I go across the world to Ethiopia, where I also work, all those plants grow there as introduced, invasive, or ornamental, but no one knows their use as food. And in some of the communities, it's very food insecure, but still people don't eat them because the knowledge from the Mexican farmers didn't come with the plants. So I think there's a big opportunity to just kind of assist in the transfer of that traditional knowledge. Anyway, we got kind of carried away with this into more theoretical ethnobotany that was maybe has no importance for the real world, but that's what you do as an academic sometimes. But we looked at the language families. So, like Spanish and English are in the same Indo-European language family, right? Or there's also the Slavic language family, which has Czech, Russian, etc., which is within Indo-European. So there are different language families. But we thought we'd look at this linguistics piece to see if there was a difference culturally that led people to adopt the crops differently. Because language is often used as a proxy for cultural similarity. For example, the Slovakian, Czech, Polish people, they have similar culture and similar language. And so we looked at the responses to our interviews. And if you map on the language families, you see that these Uto-Aztecan speaking groups, the Nawa and Raramuri, are relatively close together, even though they're geographically far apart. So that suggests that there might be some underlying cultural reason why they adopted Brassica rapa in similar ways. And otherwise, it holds up pretty well. This is central Mexico, which is just kind of a big mix of things. And then Tzotzil and Tzeltal are geographically and culturally very close, and Maya speaking. So basically, we found diverse use and management, which mirrors what we expected to have happened thousands of years ago in Europe and Asia. That cultural affinity was more important than geography in explaining the adoption. Okay, getting to this last point of the ongoing domestication. So here is where we're focused, is with the Raramuri communities in Chihuahua, Mexico. This is following up on Bob Bai's work. And as I mentioned, it's an opportunity to look at the ecological, cultural, and genetic context of domestication. So who's familiar with this study, which was done on foxes in Russia, the silver foxes? Anybody?
I think I saw it in TV in a documentary.
Yes.
Yes.
So
they select for how do you say, more peaceful animals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they selected for more peaceful ones, and what happened was they weren't just more peaceful, but within 7 generations, the coat color changed, so the hair color changed, the ears changed, the eyes became more acute. A lot of the traits were linked on the chromosomes, and so it provided some insights into the kind of genomic basis of selection and how humans might unintentionally select for certain traits just because they hitchhike. You might know the term of hitchhiking. I don't know what the equivalent is in Spanish. Okay. Okay, here we go. So for context, our study is not the first one to look at what's called ongoing or incipient domestication. In Mexico, there's been a great deal of work, and to a lesser degree in Brazil, and then much lesser degree in other places. But a real leader of this has been Alejandro Casas, who's at UNAM in Cuernavaca. He and other colleagues have looked at how farmers transplant cacti with edible fruits from wild contexts to their houses, but they don't randomly transplant them. They transplant the ones that have the best fruits. And as a result, you suddenly have a population by people's houses with a high frequency of desirable phenotypes, which are then crossing with each other, potentially genetically isolated from other populations. It's kind of the perfect storm or perfect scenario for domestication. And so they've done a great deal of studies, and I definitely recommend checking out some of Alejandro Casas's work. The problem was that they've focused almost exclusively on perennials like cacti and woody trees, which are very slowly growing, and they lack reference genomes often. And so we saw this opportunity to follow up on Robert Bai and look at Brassica rapa, which doesn't have either of those problems. Now, there was a paper published maybe 2 years ago now, which is a very nice one, that talks about how domestication likely happened. This is Alabi's paper called Domestication as a Landscape Process. And it's a little bit controversial. I don't think it should be, but a lot of people in domestication have strong opinions about things, especially in the in the archaeology side. There are some very fierce and mean debates. So I think the geneticists are much nicer. Anyway, here you have a person who is maybe encouraging certain phenotypes of wheat. Let's pretend this is wheat. The green ones are wild populations with no domestication syndrome alleles. These yellow ones have low levels of domestication alleles that people have been selecting. For example, shattering, dehiscence, or something like that. As domestication occurs, it's often not in complete isolation from the wild populations. So you can see that there's potential for crossing between the truly wild ones, the ones with low levels of domestication alleles, and the populations that are undergoing domestication in a more serious way. And then as you get fully domesticated populations, whatever that means, you still have this ongoing exchange, maybe to a lesser degree. But this is all to say that we don't think that it's so clear to have domesticated, feral, wild. In the native range of a lot of these crops, it has been a nonstop process of crossing. So there's integration from wild, even in very domesticated things, and even very recently, for example. Some of you might know those examples from Mexico where farmers will intentionally encourage teosinte in their fields because they see it as a way to replenish their crops. Maybe not in the terms of genetics, but in terms of they feel like it refreshes or makes their crops stronger. In Ethiopia, they do something similar with sorghum, wild relatives. So what we were most curious about was phenological change, because with Brassica, once it flowers, especially the weedy types, it's less tasty. At least the leaves are less tasty. And the Raramuri people like to eat the leaves. So we expected that they would be selecting for later flowering or delayed flowering. So we combined these different methods. This is Dr. Bai. So he was the one who wrote that initial article, and we went back to the field with him and his wife, Edelmira Linares. I don't know what these babies were doing here. But this is the landscape. It's a very mountainous. If you've heard of the Barranca del Cobre, this is right in the Barranca del Cobre. You can see this is one of the farms. So if you talk about potential for genetic isolation of the crops being selected, there's great potential because this isn't all good habitat for weedy Brassica rapa. Remember, it likes farms and roadsides. This is kind of intact wild vegetation. So you can see here, this is what it looks like in a field, Brassica rapa that this woman has planted. Here's the harvested leaves. And you can see this is one that's bolted or gone to seed, gone to flower rather. And this is one that spent its energy on producing leaves. So you can guess which one is preferable for the Raramuri farmers, this vegetated one. And so we collected seeds from populations across this kind of general transect. This is most of the Raramuri territory. And we made sure we collected seeds from populations that had been planted, as well as populations that were not managed, that were growing on their own, like by roadsides. And we grew them in the greenhouse together to see if there were any phenotypic differences. And we found that flowering was typically delayed to a significant degree in the managed ones. And in one case, they were delayed up to 7 days in a pairwise comparison between the managed and unmanaged ones in Panalache. I need to make these error bars better. So we think that indeed, as Robert Bai in 1979 suggested, this does constitute the potential case of domestication, but we do think it's also interesting because these were feral plants, so it's maybe a re-domestication. The other interesting piece is that this is something that's a weed in many people's eyes, but is a useful food for the Raramuri. But they've also started to select it, so it's also kind of a land race. And I don't know if I have a slide on it later, but maybe Claudio or Alejandro will talk about the case of the Argentinian re-domestication of Brassica rapa for oilseeds.
Yes, we already talked today in the morning.
Oh, amazing! Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's really, really interesting that it happened in parallel. So let's see. The general kind of conclusions, these are the areas to focus on for conservation. We think there's a lot of potential to compare wild and domesticated genomically, but also crop and feral genomically and also wild and feral genomically. So we hope to do some of that, hopefully in partnership with you all to some degree. There's also some interesting other developments happening in the domestication world, which you might know, of neo-domestication. So people domesticating crops that have never been domesticated. So this was this paper by Güdeker talking about how these desert grasses or these flood-adapted grasses could become food sources for climate change. And I thought that was interesting. Another good example is Kernza, which some of you might have heard of, the Land Institute, which is an institute in the US focused on sustainable farming. They have domesticated a perennial grass for its grains. And so it creates really, really deep roots compared to an annual. And so that's thought to be a good climate change mitigation strategy. It also requires less inputs of fertilizers, for example. Also, kind of an extension of that neo-domestication is this de novo domestication. So that's basically domesticating a wild plant, but using CRISPR or some other approach. And so some people have done this already with tomato. Someone did it with rice. So some people have talked about Brassica as an interesting case of that. So people in Chris Pierce's lab at Colorado have worked on this. There are these 30 different species of Brassica that are closely related to Brassica rapa, oleracea, et cetera, but have not been domesticated. So they're asking, you know, is it easy to just turn these into crops that are locally adapted? And Michael Pasaias is doing work on this with Brassica hilarionis, which you might remember is one of the Eastern Mediterranean, closely related to oleracea. And he's developed a platform to do this genome editing. Definitely not my area, but I thought you should be aware of it. Then there's also talk about de novo redomestication. So if you have things like feral carrots or feral rice, you know, weedy rice, maybe, is a big issue. There's potential to redomesticate feral crops because they have a genetic background that might be more diverse or more resilient. But it's quicker to develop than the truly wild crop. An example of that would be in California, you have, you know, California is one of the major agricultural parts of the United States, and they grow a lot of broccoli. They grow a lot of broccoli rabe as well, the rapini. But as you probably have heard, California has had major droughts recently. And so these droughts are causing a lot of problems with these crops. But if you look just a few kilometers away from the crops, you can find weedy feral Brassica oleracea and weedy feral Brassica rapa growing. So it's kind of interesting, you know, whether there's some potential to breed the diversity in terms of resilience to drought from these into the crop. I guess I will stop there. I think, did I share a poem last time?
Yes.
Okay, I'll share the poem again about Brassica rapa. There's a poem by a Quechua, a poet about Yuyo. Let's see, I have to find it. Basically about this feral Brassica rapa that grows in and that she really likes. So it's Chawi Yuyo. Chawi. Sorry, I should have pulled this up earlier. Occurred to me when I was talking. There, I guess one is a poem and one is a saying. One of the sayings is in Galicia, in Spain. It's the Holy Trinity is grelos, nabos, and nabisas. So it's turnip leaves, turnip tops, and turnip roots are the Holy Trinity to show how important it is culturally. Let's see. I guess we could just start the discussion now, and I'll pull it up later.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. I really I like the part that you show the comparison because between the fox, the domesticated fox, and the wild, and the domesticated. There are also a few samples in plants. I read one example. I show one example in the classes of with rice with the wild and in that they with only 5 generations, only planting and harvesting, they move all the trade from wild to domesticated, only in
Wow.
5 generations. Yes.
Wow.
That's very interesting.
I'd be interested in the paper if you could send it.
It's quite old. The author is called Oka. I will send you the paper.
That would be great.
Yes, very old, but it's very nice. Yes. And I have also I don't know if it's a question or you said that this is right that when you have the domesticated plant and then they became feral, they in general they have less variability than the crop that domesticated. But what's happened is they're instead of descended from one crop, they are descended from more than one crop, like
Yep.
endoferals.
Yes, that's a really good point. So you could see in our figure, we compared the turnips to the feral. But if we compared, maybe the feral had resulted from turnips crossing with bok choy, right? So that's a really good point and definitely could have happened and would explain it. So we would need to figure that out further. From the structure plot, we couldn't see evidence of another particular group, but it could have been turnips from the Netherlands crossing with turnips from China, for example. Yeah,
Right.
I found the poem. Can I show you the poem?
Yeah.
Okay, here it is. It's called Chawi Yuyo Mama. So Yuyo is like Jujos. So I'll let you read it so you don't have to hear my horrible Spanish. So chuño, you maybe know as the potato that's frozen and dried at high altitude. And wawita is baby in Quechua. Inti taita, father, son. Padre sol. I don't know why she says this, because to me it doesn't have sabor a hierba buena. I like this part where if her love leaves her, she'll still be happy because she has Brassica rapa, feral Brassica rapa.
Alex, you always show us your slides and all your research is that all the populations in America are feral. You have never found any wild here.
Not yet. No, not even a little bit of evidence for it. We have a little bit of evidence for truly wild ones in Algeria and Italy, in Russia, and in the Caucasus now, but we don't have, we've seen nothing that makes us think there's truly wild populations in the Americas. And what we've been meaning to do for a long time, and we've just been too lazy or busy, is just to characterize the truly wild ones morphologically and ecologically, because you know, I don't know if they are as aggressive as weeds or competitors as the feral ones. I think they probably, you know, they're probably still adapted to disturbance, but maybe in riverbanks or some other types of disturbance. So if anyone wants to do that study, I could maybe send some seeds.
Do you have the wild
Yes, you
seeds?
can send.
Yeah. They can also
Yeah.
be ordered directly from Gattersleben, the IPK gene bank in Germany. They have a lot of the the truly wild ones. So let's talk about a collaboration if you want to grow them out.
It would be great.
Yes.
Yes.
That would be great. Yes.
Okay, let me make a note.
Yes, really nice.
And
Yes, really nice.
so
Alex,
for this, yeah, go ahead.
yes, sorry. Are you planning to study also, like in Brassica oleracea, the linguistic and historical registry? I remember one paper of about Brassica rapa that talk about Sumerian tablets with the word of for rapa and also in India some old texts in I don't remember the name. I think it's Siddhartha.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be great. I've
Yes.
long wanted to do that. I think the paper you're talking about is maybe by Ignatov and Artemieva, these German. They did a linguistic.
And Pires also.
Ah,
A ver, let me see. I think I have here genomic inference of domestication events and are corroborated by written records in Brassica.
yeah, that's Mackenzie's paper.
Yes, pero in
Yeah.
Brassica rapa.
And Rapa. Oh, I see. So there is something similar. This, I'll share it. Wait, you're talking about in Rapa. So
Yes.
this is a really good paper, Origin and Expansion of Cultivated
Yes, I have that.
You've probably seen this one.
Yes.
But have any of you heard of paleobiolinguistics? This would be cool to show you. So this is basically an ethnobotanist who's also a linguist named Cecil Brown. He came up with this method called paleobiolinguistics. And let me show you how it works in principle. Okay, so it takes two different types of data. One type of data is the words for different crops in different languages. So for example, in Spanish, it's maíz. In English, it's maybe corn or maize. And in whatever, another language, it's something else. And then it also takes those language families and reconstructs the proto-language. So it's very much like, maybe you know that linguistics is sort of like genetics in that they can create a phylogenetic tree of languages. You know, you have Spanish and Italian and Romanian, and
Yes.
and then you have English and German, right? And you can do phylogenetic analyses on that data. And they can trace back and see when was the most common recent ancestor of German and Spanish, for example. And they can estimate the date, just like we can estimate with genetics the date. And so take those two pieces of data. I'll show you on a map. This one's for maybe chili peppers. What is this for? Yeah, chili peppers. I think. Yeah. And this looks at, well, its better map is Mexico. So each one of these dots is a language, a proto-language location and time, if that makes sense. So you could also put Indo-European, the language family that has English, Spanish, Hindi, Czech. You could put that in a place and time where that was spoken before it diverged. And that was somewhere in Ukraine, right? And that was spoken maybe 5,000 years ago. So we know that. But they've done that on this map. But you see down here, it says whether the term for chili pepper reconstructs in that proto-language. So it's kind of hard to grasp, but these languages were spoken this long ago, and they were able to reconstruct the word for chili pepper in this language. Therefore, we expect that chili peppers were known to the people there that long ago. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so there was a really cool paper, this one, by Kraft et al. You might have seen it, but they took that data and they combined it with different lines of evidence, including genetic, archaeological, linguistic, and ecological. And here. And they were able to create these heat maps, basically. So this is using linguistics. Remember, this is the area where those big circles were, that the word for chili reconstructed a long time ago. The genetic data suggests that it's this area. The archaeological data, they only have 2 caves. So it's one or the other of these. And then this is an ecological niche model that suggests that these kind of coastal areas were important habitats for it a long time ago. And then you can give different weight to those different lines of evidence. So this is saying that all of that, so the archaeological, genomic, linguistic, and ecological data is all equally credible or important. This one is saying that genetics is the most reliable, but will include some information from these other ones. And this one's saying that the archaeological one's the least reliable, so we'll include less information from that. And this is a really, it's amazing that this hasn't really taken off. This was maybe 2014. But to me, this seems like it sets the standard for very rigorous domestication hypothesis testing, where you're modeling it very explicitly. Anyway, I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but linguistics has a lot of potential. The problem is no one does paleobiolinguistics in Europe and Asia, where Brassica rapa is. So I'm looking for a linguist who would, because there's so many crops that they could. So Cecil Brown only did it for the Americas, but he did maize, he did squash, he did beans, he just went crazy. So.
Yeah, I don't know if we talk about this, but maybe you find interesting also. I read some old texts from colonial America, from Lima, Peru, about the Brassica rapa, about, in the 16th century. Where
was it the Relaciones Geográficas?
I think
Or something like that.
maybe
I don't know. It's okay. Yeah.
Yes, no, and say that there were in that time Brassica rapa growing wild in the countries, in the fields.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Oh yeah, please send that. That would be very interesting.
Yes.
I don't have
If I
anything like
found it, I read it for my thesis long time ago. But if I found, I send it. Yes.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have anything from Peru or anything that old in the Americas about it. Huh. So for the grad students here, are your theses or dissertations focused on something related to domestication or more broadly genetics or crop sciences, or what are your areas?
Cos, ¿quién puede decirlo en español? No hay
Okay,
problema.
Sabine.
Oh,
Son muy tímidos.
yeah,
Fabian.
hi.
That's okay. Hmm. Well, yeah. So in any case, it would be great to keep talking about potential to grow out the wild and the domesticate and the feral all together and characterize them. So if you're interested, I'll send you seeds and we can do it. Is it difficult to import seeds there? I don't want to create the next
I think that
Wait,
might be difficult, yes, because there are, I don't know, because with the Brassica rapa is really a problem in Argentina. I don't know if it's going to be easy to import the wild population. It would be really nice to see, but
we have imported seeds.
Yes.
They
Yes.
don't
Yes.
they don't
Okay.
read much. They read Brassica rapa. Yeah,
we can try.
why weedy? They don't care.
Yeah, if it's easier, I can tell you which accessions it is from the gene bank in Germany.
Great.
Maybe it's easier than me just shipping it as
Yes.
seed if it's from a
It
German.
would be really nice
Yes.
because it would be really nice to compare and see if there are really different traits between the wild and the weedy.
Yeah.
For me, there are, I know the specialty in Brassica rapa as Claudio, Soledad, Sofia. For me, all the population looks really similar. I don't know how they find so huge variation in the crop. I don't know how, because for me, they're quite similar. I don't know.
Most of the weedy and wild ones look the same to me, basically. Some of them have a little rounder leaves. There's also feral bok choy that we found recently in Japan. And that has a little bit rounder leaves. So that's kind of Do you have a name for the superweed brassica yet?
Well,
Yes, there are, yes, in the agriculture, they call nabolsa. Nabolsa. It's like the mixture of nabo and colza.
Nabolsa.
Yes.
Okay.
Because they know in some way that they have some trait of colza.
Yeah.
So they use the two words and the nabolsa.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's interesting. What's nabicol? Isn't nabicol something?
yes. Yes, it's a crop.
That's maybe rutabaga.
Yes, rutabaga. Yes.
Okay. So nabolsa, nabicol.
Yes.
Okay. I like that, nabolsa. And so how has the weed problem spread since we last talked? Is it all over or?
It's
Yes.
still growing. It's
Yes.
really
Yes.
now it's closer to our area.
Ah,
Yes.
what makes it easier for you to study?
Yes.
But not a good thing. Ah,
And also,
Wow.
it arrived to Europe via,
Really?
yes, but via not seed contamination, but gene flow between oilseed rape canola that we, as a country, we sell the seeds to Europe, and
Uh-huh.
Brassica rapa. And in Europe, they were very mad, very angry because they found the transgene, and they blame Argentina for send transgenic seeds that are not allowed from Bayer company.
Bye.
The
Yes.
company, yes.
Yeah, Bear, yeah.
Yes, and they have to pay like
Yes, like
20
$2,000.
$2,000 or
Yes,
per
$2,000 or euro.
Better.
Yes, something.
So they got fined for it, even though it's illegal in Argentina and unintentional.
Yes, the Argentinian government say it's impossible.
Yeah.
We have no transgene.
We have no, yes.
Yes, we
This is
know
not
we
true.
have transgene.
Wow. So
They didn't write.
so there's a potential that it is spreading in Europe.
When they found it, they burned
Burn
the fields.
everything.
Yes.
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 Well,
But maybe.
yeah, they can't keep it out forever, I think.
No, no.
As long as it doesn't make it to Georgia. I'm sure Georgia has very strict customs rules. All right. Well, I should go. I need to make it to my train.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. So good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very
you,
much,
Alex.
Alex. Thank you again.
Have a good one.
Wonderful
Thank you.
talk.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. ¿Cómo hago para dejar de grabar?